$1, 3 and 5, 2 floors of general use books, and then a 3rd floor with rare books, autographs, manuscripts, first editions, leather bindings, and so on. In that type of business, the large, old, general, secondhand bookstore, especially in the inner cities, is a dying business. It's not dying because people don't like books, buy books, read books, sell books, but particularly in the last 10 or 20 years, property value has gone so high, that rent has gone so high, that old bookstores, which are not the most efficiently run businesses in the world, one right after the other have been going out of business, and in the last couple of years, the internet has just speeded that process along. Now, like I say, we own the property, so I hope to do this for years to come. And I've done this all my life. My parents say my first word was book. I have no idea. Maybe it was. I'm sure they were talking about them. And then I worked after school in elementary school, junior high school, summers during college. I have a degree in chemistry from the University of Massachusetts. I was going to get a doctoral degree at the University of Wisconsin, but in 1973, I needed a year off. My father's health wasn't that good. That year now is over 40 years, and I don't regret for a minute that I'm doing this and not in a laboratory somewhere. If you would ask me what's one item I wish I could find, it's a little pamphlet here called Tamerlane by a Bostonian, done in 1827. It doesn't look like very much, but the Bostonian who did this was Edgar Allan Poe. It's his first book. It's a classic rarity in American literature. As a matter of fact, the first copy to ever really be found was in the 1890s on a book dealer's 10-cent table. Another dealer spotted it there, bought a stack of books so it wouldn't stand out. And in 1890, sold it for $1,000. Then in the 1950s, there were 2 postmen who on the side were book scouts. Being postmen, they knew where all the yard sales were. They bought a trunk of books, bottom of the trunk, Tamerlane. Families got involved, they got to negotiating, and after 6 months, they sold it for $10,000. Now, I don't know if it was worth it, because they started out best of friends. By the time they sold it, they never spoke again, but they got their $10,000. And then about 10 or 12 years ago, an antique dealer in the Newburyport area died. His whole estate was auctioned. Paintings, prints, books. Books as a group, $600 to an antique dealer in New Hampshire. They took all the pamphlets, put them in a box, $15 each. Someone, of course, picked out a Tamerlane, and about 10 years ago sold it for $198,000, and a copy a few years ago sold for $800,000. And let me just say, this is a facsimile. A lot of what I bring with me are originals, but I don't bring million-dollar pamphlets. But if any of you want to take a close look and then go home and check your attic, cellars, basements, whatever, if you find one, please give me a call. I'd love to hear about it. A lot of the fun of collecting is learning about something, is studying it, is appreciating it. I mean, it's really your knowledge that makes something interesting and thus valuable. Someone might look at something and say, oh, that's a scrap of paper. Someone else might say, that's a broadside that led to the Boston Tea Party, that led to the American Revolution, that led to our country's independence. So it's really the knowledge, the understanding that makes things interesting. Now, here's an item that I think on the surface is interesting, but the story behind it may be even more so. This is on White House stationery. It's dated April 11th, 1933, and it starts, Dear Jim, I want to send you this note to tell you how happy I am that you are to represent the United States in Poland. It's the most important post, etc., signed always sincerely Franklin Roosevelt, and it's to the Honorable James Michael Curley, Mayor of Boston. Now, this is an ambassadorial appointment and a great honor. Well, Curley didn't think it was such an honor. Matter of fact, I think he thought Roosevelt was trying to get rid of him, which of course he probably was. And Curley's response to Roosevelt, remember this was 1933, he said, in Poland, with Germany on one side, Russia on the other, you should send your worst Republican enemy to Poland. He said, matter of fact, if you think it's so important, why don't you quit and go there yourself? Now, Curley's response in feelings about Washington didn't change over the years. We also have about 10 letters that he wrote to his wife when he was in Danbury prison. Now, even though these were personal letters, he was still very much the politician. And there was one quote I particularly liked. He had just gotten into prison, and he wrote to his wife, and he said, "Many of the four-legged creatures in my cell have more honor than the two-legged creatures in Washington." In any case, enough for Curly. And a lot of the things we get aren't just books, but we get paper, ephemera, programs. Here's a program from the 1912 World Series where the Red Sox played the Giants. The Red Sox won the World Series in 1912, won a few more times in up until 18. And by the way, when they won it in 18, they beat the Cubs. And then we had to wait a long time. We'll see what this year brings, maybe. But not only is it interesting as a baseball item, but on the back there's an ad for Arrow shirts and collars. Collars are $2 for $1. Shirts are $1.50 and $2. I think they'll go for a little more nowadays. It's also become very popular to go on cruises and cruise ships. I have a brochure here for a ship that tells you how wonderfully built, where to book passage. And anyone who wants to go on the Titanic, this is a brochure for it. And, you know, almost anything you can think of, there are people out there who are interested. There are whole societies of Titanic historians who do nothing but study the Titanic. And there's also a tendency, whenever you talk about books and book collecting, or any type of collecting for that matter, all of a sudden everything seems to be worth $1,000, $100,000, $1 million. And I like to point out, not everything has to be high priced to be fun. Old Life magazines, for instance. Here's one with Errol Flynn on the cover. Another with Elizabeth Taylor when she was 15 years old. And the large majority sell for $1, $2. I mean, they're very inexpensive. There are lots of them. There are a few exceptions, but they're very cheap. And matter of fact, we used to have a wall at the store by a stairway where we had 100 or so more of the more famous lives. People would stop and stare at that wall, sometimes a half an hour at a time, just lost in thought and memory. They loved them for the covers, the stories, the articles, the photographs. They made wonderful birthday or anniversary presents if you fell in the right dates. And we had a regular customer one day come in, and he bought about 50 Life magazines from World War II, which is not what he normally bought. And I said to him, "Why are you buying these?" He said, "Well, I want to teach my children about World War II." And he thought a nice way to do it would be to get some of the old Lives, look at a few of the photos, read an article or two, and then discuss it with them. Sounded like a good idea to me. I was a little skeptical. But he came in a couple of weeks later, and I said to him, "How's it going with the Lives?" He said, "Fabulously," but not the way I thought. He says the kids don't care about the stories, the articles, the photographs, but they love the ads. And he says, and it turns out by looking at and discussing the ads with them, he could probably teach them more about what the United States was like during World War II than if they had done everything else anyways. And I have other things. I have a cookbook here from the 1700s. Some of the recipes are wonderful. And then you have how to bake eels the common way. I don't know if I want to bake them anyway, but that's beside the point. One of the most interesting parts about the business for me is going out to houses and estates. That's how we get most of our books. It's almost like being Jim Hawkins on Treasure Island every day, never knowing what you're going to see, who, the people, the places, and so on. And I'll relate a few of those stories to you, and then after that maybe see about some questions. I was out of the store. I got back a while ago, and there was a message that a Mrs. Fisher had called and had some books. I called her up, and she said, "Yes, my father died in Providence. We have 500 art reference books. We want to get the best price we can. We're inviting a number of dealers down to bid on them. Would you be interested?" Well, 500 art reference books sounded like a good library. Providence is only an hour from Boston. They lived on an old street called Benefit Street up near Brown University. I got to the house. It was a large old colonial house. I got led through the house into a courtyard, into a garage. Second floor of the garage, they had 5,000 books. Well, it turned out her married name was Fisher, but her father's name was John Nicholas Brown. Family founded Brown University, one of the wealthier families in the country. And after about 6 months, I bought about 80% of the books I wanted, and I was happy, and she was pleased, and she said, "My mother has a lot of books. Most are being given to the university, some are being sold at auction, but would you like to take a trip to Newport to take a look at the books there?" Well, their house in Newport is one of the mansions on the ocean. I mentioned this to my wife. She decided to come with me on this deal. And one of the fascinating parts about it was being in one of those mansions that was still being lived in by a family. And at one point, wandering from the basement to the attic, all on my own, without a tour guide saying, "Come here, go here, do this." It was fascinating. Another time I got called to Newport to do an appraisal. Now, when I come to groups like this, I do hundreds of free appraisals. Matter of fact, my goal is that whenever you think of an old book, you think of me in the Brattle Bookshop. I don't care if you think of 10 others, just as long as I'm one of the 10. And one of the ways I feel I can do that is by giving out as much free information as reasonably possible. But there are times when people need very formal written appraisals for insurance, estate taxes, then I discuss a fee. In any case, Newport, another mansion, not quite as big as the Browns. This was the Perry family. Commodore Perry, Oliver Hazard Perry, and what they had was a whole stack of papers from the War of 1812. During the war, their family were privateers. Well, they're privateers if you're on our side. They're pirates if you're on the other side. It's all the way you look at it. But it was the day-to-day accountings of the ships, and they were fascinating to read through. They would sometimes capture a ship and realize tens of thousands of dollars profit. In 1812, that was an incredible amount of money. Then one day, one of the ships got into a battle. The ship got hit. The captain got hit. He lost his leg. About 3 days later, at the bottom of the page, there was an entry. Captain, $5 bonus, loss of leg. And that was the last you heard of the captain. So a little different nowadays, too. When my father was still alive, and he died over 30 years ago, we got a call from a lady. She was very vague about her name, what she had or so on, but it sounded like she might have a few interesting things, and she lived relatively close by. We got to her house. It was a little ranch house. Paint was peeling, weeds were growing, and you sort of say to yourself, "Oh, gee, what's going to be here?" She answered the door. She was quite elderly, and we walk in, and there were just gorgeous antiques everywhere. I mean, really, really beautiful antiques. And she got to talking. It turned out she was originally from the Boston area, but she had married the Prince of the Ukraine, the cousin of the Tsar of Russia. He had escaped just before the revolution. And she told story after story about being Russian nobility in Europe and all the court intrigues and all the goings-on, how T.E. Shaw used to stay at their house all the time, how she didn't think he accidentally died on a motorcycle, but there was a lot more to it. T.E. Shaw, of course, was Lawrence of Arabia. And she went on and on and on with these wonderful stories. Turned out her books were lousy, but the stories were absolutely wonderful. And when we first got into the house, on one of her walls, she had 10 watercolors. They were nice pastoral European scenes. When I first saw them, I thought they were nice. And the more she talked and the longer we were there and the more I looked at them, the nicer I thought they were. And I finally said to her, "You know, those 10 watercolors, they're really nice." And she turned around and said, "Oh, yes, they're all Turners." So she had 10 original Turner watercolors, probably $1 million worth of painting. And it was like, "Oh, yes, they're all Turners." So you never know what you're going to see, the people, the places, the characters. And matter of fact, speaking of characters, about 15 years ago, we went to one of our customers' 100th birthday parties. Now, when you go to a man's 100th birthday party, and he tells you he just got back from Barcelona, he's going to give a talk in Florida, and he's been asked to lecture in Tokyo. And I finally said to him, "Wait a minute, you're 100 years old. Don't you think Tokyo is an awfully long way to go?" And he said, "Well, when I used to work, it took me well over 25 hours to get to Chicago." He says, "I don't think Tokyo's a whole lot further than that nowadays." And here's a man who can also tell you about one day sitting down to dinner with Henry Ford and Thomas Edison. He was a young man at the time, and he was really looking forward to this dinner and all the learning and insight he was going to get from these two men. He said he was excited enough. He got there a little bit early, sat down. 5 minutes later, Ford came in and sat down next to him. And about 15 minutes later, Edison came in. Now, Edison was elderly, had one of those big horns for hearing, sat down opposite, and he said the first thing, Ford turned to Edison and yelled, "My Tom, you look very good." And Edison turned to Ford and yelled, "It's the Carter's Little Liver Pills." This man said all night long, all they did was yell about Carter's Little Liver Pills. And he said next time he wanted to learn something, he went to the library. Now, I can go on and on and on with these stories. I'll tell one more, and then we'll see about some questions. We get hundreds of phone calls at the store. Do you have a book? Can you get a book? How hard is it to get the book? Does the book exist? Or what's the value? How much is it worth? And so on. And most of those questions, either I or the people I work with, we can answer right off the top of our heads. Some are a little more involved in